You'd think a wild animal's trust in a human is random, a 50-50 gamble, pure luck of who happened to be standing there. Here's the uncomfortable part. It's not random at all. Somewhere out there, animals are running a quiet, ongoing background check on every human they encounter, and most of us have no idea we've ever been evaluated. So let's actually ask the question properly. How does a wild animal, a creature with every evolutionary reason to treat humans as a threat, decide that one specific person is safe enough to trust, safe enough to be near her offspring, safe enough to approach during the most vulnerable moment of her life? Because this isn't about animals trusting humanity broadly. It's far more specific than that. It's about one individual animal deciding through some process we're only beginning to understand that you, specifically out of every human on the planet, have passed some kind of test. Let's start with something almost everyone who's ever lived near stray or feral cats has experienced without fully realizing what was happening. Outdoor cats and feral colonies are remarkably good at what researchers sometimes describe as building a mental map, essentially an ongoing internal classification system sorting every human they encounter into categories: safe, unsafe, unknown, worth watching. This isn't some vague, fuzzy impression. It's built through repeated, careful observation. A cat watching a particular human across weeks or months is tracking specific, measurable things: how consistently that person behaves, whether their movements are slow and predictable or sudden and erratic, whether they've ever raised a hand, a voice, or a broom in the cat's direction, and whether food or safety has ever reliably followed that person's presence. Once a human clears enough of these checkpoints consistently, something shifts. That person gets mentally reclassified, not as a stranger anymore, but as something closer to a known, low-risk entity, occasionally even something resembling an extension of the cat's own social world. And that reclassification carries real consequences, because once you've cleared that bar, you gain access to a level of trust most humans never even realize they've earned, including, in some well-documented cases, being the specific human a mother cat chooses to bring her kittens to. There's a sensory layer underneath all of this that rarely gets enough attention, and it's worth pulling out on its own, because scent plays a genuinely enormous role in how many animals build and store this kind of individual trust profile. Humans produce a distinctive, fairly stable chemical signature, a mix of skin oils, sweat compounds, soap, and whatever else happens to cling to us, and animals with strong scent-based memory, which describes most mammals to some degree, appear capable of cataloging specific individual human scent profiles with real precision, the same way they might catalog the scent of a trusted member of their own social group. Once a particular human's scent gets filed under safe and predictable, that classification appears able to persist in an animal's memory for a genuinely long time, which helps explain why some trust-based interactions happen even with humans who've only had a small handful of prior encounters with that specific animal. Scent, in other words, may function as a kind of quiet, constantly updating identification badge, one most humans have no idea they're even carrying. Crows take the visual and experiential side of this same basic principle and push it somewhere genuinely remarkable, because crow memory for individual human faces is, frankly, better than most people would expect from a bird. Researchers studying crow cognition have found that crows can recognize and remember specific individual human faces for years, not vague categories of humans, specific faces tied to specific past experiences. A crow that's been fed, helped, or simply treated gently by a particular person appears to file that individual away as reliably safe, sometimes for the rest of its life. A crow that's been threatened, chased, or harmed by a specific person files that individual away just as permanently, and will reportedly scold or avoid that exact person on sight, sometimes years later. What makes this even more striking is that this recognition doesn't seem to stay contained to the individual crow that had the original experience. There's evidence suggesting young crows raised around a parent who treats a specific human as safe may absorb that same assessment, essentially inheriting a verdict about a person they've never personally tested themselves, which raises a genuinely interesting possibility that at least some of this trust isn't purely built through direct individual experience. It may be, at least partially, something closer to socially transmitted knowledge, passed from one generation to the next the way a human child might absorb which neighbors are. Considered trustworthy without ever being explicitly told why. It's worth pausing here to compare this against dogs for a moment, because the contrast is genuinely illuminating. Dog trust in humans looks similar on the surface, but it operates on a fundamentally different foundation. Roughly 15 to 40,000 years of domestication have essentially preloaded dogs with a baseline predisposition toward trusting humans in general. A starting point: wolves simply don't share. Even wolves raised by humans from birth show measurably less spontaneous trust and cooperative eye contact than dogs do. A dog's individual trust in one specific person builds on top of that pre-existing foundation. A wild crow, cat, or elephant has no such head start. Every single trust relationship a wild animal builds with a specific human is constructed essentially from zero, entirely through direct or socially transmitted experience, with no evolutionary shortcut helping it along the way, which arguably makes wild trust considerably more impressive than domesticated trust, precisely because it has to be earned from a genuinely neutral, occasionally hostile starting position. Primates offer yet another angle on this, and it's a particularly compelling one because primate social cognition mirrors our own so closely. There are documented cases of wild and semi-wild primates, certain monkey species, chimpanzees, and bonobos among them, at long-term research sites bringing injured or orphaned infants directly toward familiar human researchers. Individuals the group has observed behaving calmly and predictably across months or years of repeated contact. This connects to something primates already do among themselves, a behavior researchers call alloparenting, where infants are cared for not only by their biological mother, but by a wider trusted network within the group, aunts, older siblings, occasionally unrelated adults who've proven themselves reliable over time. Extending that same alloparenting logic to include a long-term, consistently non-threatening human observer isn't actually as large a cognitive leap as it might initially sound. If a troop has spent years watching a particular researcher behave calmly and predictably, that researcher effectively gets absorbed into the troop's existing mental category of acceptable, trusted caregivers, a genuinely narrow and specific category to earn membership in, but apparently achievable given enough patience, consistency, and an absence of any sudden, threatening movement. Now let's move to something with even more social and cognitive complexity behind it, because dolphins and elephants both offer a genuinely different kind of evidence for this same underlying pattern. Dolphins live in tightly bonded social pods that already practice sophisticated cooperative behaviors, shared caregiving, coordinated group decision-making, mutual assistance during moments of distress. Researchers studying dolphins' social cognition have pointed out that a species already wired to recognize distress and coordinate helpful responses within its own pod doesn't need an enormous cognitive leap to occasionally extend that same recognition across species lines, particularly toward a species, humans, that has consistently demonstrated slow, careful, non-threatening behavior around boats over many repeated encounters. Elephants push this even further, largely because of their famously long, detailed memory. There are well-documented cases of elephants, particularly in sanctuary and conservation settings, recognizing specific individual caretakers after years, sometimes over a decade, of separation, responding with behavior that researchers studying elephant cognition describe as showing clear signs of genuine recognition rather than generic, non-specific curiosity. If an elephant can hold onto a detailed, positive memory of one specific human for 10 plus years, it becomes considerably less surprising that the same elephant might eventually decide that particular human is a safe option during a genuine crisis involving her calf. There's a specific piece of research worth pulling in here because it helps tie all of this together in a genuinely satisfying way. It's sometimes called the safe haven hypothesis, and while the name sounds like it belongs in a fairly dry academic paper, the underlying idea is honestly one of the more moving concepts in this entire topic. The theory proposes that across multiple, entirely independently evolved social species, individual animals can form something structurally similar to an attachment bond with a specific human, not identical in depth or complexity to a human parent-child bond, but genuinely similar in basic structure. Animals that form this kind of bond don't merely tolerate the human in question. They actively seek that person out specifically during moments of stress. The same basic pattern you'd see in a frightened child running directly toward a trusted parent instead of scattering randomly in any direction. Once you understand that framework, an animal mother approaching a specific trusted human during an emergency involving her offspring stops looking strange or magical at all. It starts looking exactly like what you'd expect from any creature seeking out its own particular version of a safe haven. There's a well-documented case worth mentioning here that illustrates this particularly well. Researchers and sanctuary workers studying elephant behavior have recorded multiple instances of elephant mothers in rehabilitation and conservation settings approaching specific, familiar caretakers, standing beside them for extended periods with an injured or distressed calf, and appearing to wait, sometimes for hours, in a manner researchers have described as closely resembling a deliberate request for intervention rather than random proximity seeking. In several of these documented cases, the specific caretaker approached had a long, established history with that particular elephant, sometimes stretching back years, involving countless small, unremarkable, low-stakes interactions that that, individually, would have seemed completely unimportant at the time. It was only the accumulated weight of all of them together that appears to have produced the level of trust required for that single, high-stakes moment. It's worth being honest here too, because this trust is neither universal nor unconditional, and the honest version of this story has to include that. Animal populations that have experienced consistent negative interactions with humans, heavily hunted species, animals in areas with significant human-wildlife conflict, populations that have been actively persecuted, show essentially none of this trust-extending behavior. This particular pattern shows up almost exclusively in populations that have experienced either a meaningful history of low-conflict coexistence with humans, individual positive encounters that specific animals can personally recall, or, in the case of highly social, highly intelligent species, enough cognitive and social sophistication to make genuinely nuanced, case-by-case judgments about specific individual humans rather than judging our entire species as a single uniform threat. Which means, in the end, these animals aren't extending trust to humanity as some broad, generalized category. They're extending trust to you, specifically, the one who moved slowly, who didn't raise your voice, who left food out consistently, who behaved in a way that, over repeated encounters, quietly built a case file in your favor. There's also a feedback loop worth mentioning here. Because trust like this doesn't just sit still once it's established, it tends to compound over time. A single positive interaction gets remembered. That memory shapes how the animal, or in some documented cases its offspring, responds to that same human, or sometimes humans in general, during future encounters. Each additional positive encounter reinforces and strengthens the existing assessment, gradually lowering that animal's baseline fear response. Sometimes across an entire family group or social unit, not just the original individual who had the experience. It's a slow, cumulative, case-by-case process, built one calm interaction at a time, rather than some instantaneous decision made in a single dramatic moment. Which is exactly why this kind of trust tends to show up most reliably around individuals and communities with a long, consistent track record, not single isolated incidents of kindness. Here's where this connects back to something genuinely worth sitting with. Every quiet, unremarkable interaction you've ever had with a wild or semi-wild animal, every time you moved slowly instead of startling it, every time you left food out without expecting anything back, every time you responded to visible distress with calm patience instead of panic, was very possibly logged somewhere, evaluated, and filed away as a small data point in an ongoing case file you never knew existed. Most of those interactions go completely unnoticed, quietly building or quietly failing to build trust in the background of your everyday life without you ever finding out the result either way. Which means that trust, when it does eventually show up, when an animal mother approaches you specifically during a genuine moment of crisis, isn't some random stroke of luck at all. It's the outcome of an evaluation process you've likely been unknowingly participating in the entire time. One slow, careful, unremarkable interaction after another. And there's something worth adding here, a kind of quiet responsibility buried inside all of this. If trust like this really is built one small, unremarkable interaction at a time, accumulated slowly across months or years, then it can very likely be damaged just as easily, sometimes in a single careless moment. A sudden loud noise, one instance of chasing an animal off out of irritation, one moment of impatience where caution would have served better, could plausibly undo a portion of trust that took a genuinely long time to build in the first place. Which means every one of those small, unremarkable interactions carries more weight than it feels like it does in the moment. Not because any single encounter guarantees anything on its own, but because each one is quietly, invisibly, contributing to a running total that eventually gets tested one way or another when it matters most. Conservation researchers studying human-wildlife relationships have increasingly started treating these trust-based interactions as more than just heartwarming anecdotes worth sharing, but as genuine, measurable indicators of local ecosystem health, since a wild population willing to approach humans during moments of crisis is very often a population living somewhere with meaningfully lower hunting pressure, lower habitat conflict, and a longer accumulated track record of coexistence rather than competition. So the next time you hear about a stray cat delivering her kittens to a specific person's porch, or a crow that seems to recognize and greet one particular individual, or an elephant that clearly remembers a caretaker after years years apart, don't file it away as some kind of unexplainable animal magic. File it away as exactly what it actually is: hard evidence of a careful, ongoing, remarkably sophisticated evaluation process. One built patiently across repeated encounters that occasionally, when the stakes are highest, results in a wild animal looking directly at one specific human being and deciding, based on real accumulated evidence, that this particular person can be trusted with something as vulnerable and as important as her own offspring.